This is a reading from The Evidence of Satan in the Modern World by Leon Christiani. Magic in the 20th Century, Chapter 7, A Curious Encounter. Before starting on the subject of this chapter, I should like, if I may, to relate a purely personal incident. Whilst I was engaged on the present book, I received a letter from a priest whom I did not know, and who was completely unaware of the work I was doing. He had just read another book on the same subject and had written to offer me his documentation. "Suppose I had some material," he said. "Well, I have. Come and have a look at it." Since it was difficult for me to go to him, he came to see me. His material was of immense interest. For the last 6 years, he has been engaged in a constant struggle with Satan, and we have seen, in the case of the woman of Piacenza, just what a struggle that can be. If our century is inclined to question the existence of Satan, as of so many other things, this priest has evidence enough of his existence, his power, his activity, the means he uses, subject to God's permission, and the terrible state to which he can reduce a poor human being. I am authorized to give the name of this contemporary witness to the struggle against Satan. It is Father Berger from Chavagne-Paillet in the Vendée. Although he has published nothing himself, I am authorized to say on his behalf that he is prepared to meet any audience to discuss the exorcisms which he has carried out during the last 6 years, some of which are still continuing. Naturally, we shall only be able to take a glimpse at his vast material, from which the following facts are derived. Discretion requires that the persons concerned should only be indicated by their initials, and that the places in question will not, of course, be mentioned. Some of these exorcisms were relatively easy and yielded a rapid success. Others were more complex, very laborious, and much slower in producing a result. In these latter cases, as in the case at Piacenza, it would seem that whenever the exorcism brought any perceptible relief to the victim, it was immediately nullified by new sortileges operating from a distance. Amongst all of the case histories I was offered, I have selected one only, which appeared particularly significant. It is the case of Madame G., a married woman with one daughter. The file in question contains no less than 145 documents, covering the period 14th of September 1953 to the 5th of February 1959, and is not yet closed. We should first give some indication of the way in which the case began, and for this we shall rely on the notes provided by the victim's own husband. Although the present writer has put them into narrative form, the incidents are, in every detail, exactly those provided by the husband, retaining as far as possible his own words. A deadly fatigue. It begins, says Mr. G., in September 1950. Our 2-year-old daughter Annie was sleeping badly. Ever since she was born, my wife has had to spend many nights almost without sleeping herself. She began to suffer from a general and disquieting sense of fatigue, so we consulted a doctor. The doctor noted the following evident symptoms: no interest in work, continual lassitude, loss of weight, vertigo, etc. He was, however, reassuring. The case, he considered, was not alarming. All that was needed was quiet, good food, and sleep. In other words, 3 weeks in a convalescent home or rest house. It sounded quite easy, but we were not covered by any social insurance. My wife had never left home. A stay away from home would mean a big expense, so we decided to disregard the doctor's advice. 3 weeks passed. My wife's health remained the same. One day, when I was in town, I met one of my wife's friends who inquired after her. When I said she was no better, she said, "Why don't you go to B? He cured my son when he was suffering from nerves, and I was very satisfied. My son is eating and sleeping well now, and his nerves give us practically no trouble." I was impressed by her confidence and asked for B's address. He was, in fact, a healer, apparently very well known in the district. "He comes to S.J. every Saturday," she said, "and he sees people all day. Go and see him. It doesn't cost anything to try." But the good woman added a remark without appearing to think it was important. "The chap rather frightens me. When I went with my boy, the first time he took off a lock of his hair, took it between his fingers and rubbed it, saying, 'Yes, It is his nerves which are causing the trouble. But whilst he was saying this, I could see a sort of blue smoke rising from his fingers. When I got home, I told my wife all about it. The story of the blue smoke and the lock of hair did not worry her. She didn't believe in that sort of thing. It was therefore agreed that we would go and see him the following Saturday. By chance, he did not come to S.J. that week for his usual consultations. My mother was still alive at that time, and she said to us, "My children, I don't want to stop you going to see this B, but you know, I don't trust him. All his family are swine, and he'd kill off half the population of S.J. if he'd had his way." But this warning did not stop us. The following Saturday, we presented ourselves at the famous healer's. A session with the healer. His wife opened the door to us and received us in a friendly way. We waited for our turn, and when the healer called us, he asked us to sit down and began the consultation. "Your name and Christian name, madam, and your date of birth?" When he had noted these details, B cut off a lock of my wife's hair. He held it between the thumb and the first finger of his left hand, and with his right held my wife's wrist. There was a moment's silence. He rubbed thumb and finger together, and without a word being said, there was suddenly a puff of blue smoke rising some inches above his hand. It was just like a cigarette which goes on burning on the edge of an ashtray. After a moment he opened his fingers and, strange to say, there was not a trace of hair left. "There's something wrong with your nerves," B declared, "but don't worry, that's my specialty. 2 or 3 sessions will put you right again." Then he took a flask containing some unknown substance, stuck his thumb into the flask for more than a few seconds. He was watching the time carefully with his watch in front of him, and then hastily withdrew it. Then he took hold of my wife's wrists and became suddenly tense and as red in the face as a tomato. This lasted a few minutes, during which time he kept his head lowered. All of a sudden my wife shut her eyes and began to go to sleep. Thereupon the healer let go of her wrists and began to wake her up. B declared that he had a pain at the back of his neck for what he had been doing. He said, was very exhausting. He seized an ampoule of ether and squirted down the back of his neck to restore himself. Then he squirted some down my wife's neck. She seemed a bit stupefied, and she said that her head felt heavy after those few minutes of peculiar sleep. The session was over. My wife felt a little better than she had done an hour previously. The healer gave her his private address in case he wanted to go and see him there. But he also said, in case we wanted to go and see him there, but he also said he would be back at S.J. in a fortnight's time. Uncanny Slumbers. We left feeling that there was a good chance of a cure, but that very evening, whilst we were having supper, my wife suddenly dropped her fork and, laying her head on her plate, went to sleep. I could not make out what was happening. 2 minutes passed, 2 very long minutes. Then my wife came to and said, "What does it mean?" Everything suddenly faded out and I couldn't see anything, and now I feel quite dazed and worn out. A few moments later, she felt better and declared, "Now I'm hungry." The next day and the following day, the same thing occurred. My wife would go to sleep during the meal. In the evening, just when she was going to bed at about 8:30 or 9 p.m., she began jabbering strange words and sniggering in a strange way at the ceiling, as if she saw something there. She would walk around the table in a crazy way, pointing at things, as if she were a dumb person trying to make herself understood. I used to try to stop her, but she would push me away as if I had become an unpleasant stranger. I could not make any sense of it, and I began to wonder what the person had done to my life, by his magnetism, as he called it. It couldn't go on like that. So this Thursday, after our first visit, we went to his house. Further trouble. When we explained what was happening, the healer made the very strange excuse that he had been mistaken in the month of my wife's birth, and that with people born in that month, one had to go very gently, although there was nothing to be alarmed about. We could go home again quite happily because everything would go much better. As he said this, B was radiant. We understood why later. Satan had carried out his orders. Our return was his first victory. Then my wife went to sleep again, on the spot, in the presence of the healer. He made light of it and contented himself with saying, "You will eat well when you leave here, you will see, and you will sleep well tonight." And to tell the truth, on the way home my wife did eat. I think it must have been a whole hand of bananas. When she went to bed, She slept like a log, which we understood later, because Satan had a hand in it. When she woke up in the morning, once more she felt completely dazed. Days passed, and her state grew worse. She suffered terribly from headaches, which she had never had before. Sometimes she felt terrible shock, and began to cry at the pain it caused her. Then suddenly she would calm down, become tense, standing distraught, her eyes haggard and wide open, fixed on the ceiling and with her arms outstretched. She would often say, "I think I'm going mad." At other times she would be like one dead. I could not move her for fear of breaking a bone. She neither saw nor heard me. This would last for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes just a quarter of an hour, and there I was, quite helpless, not knowing what to do. Naturally, the following Saturday, when B came to SJ for his consultations, we went to see him and complain. So we had another session, during which he held my wife's wrists. Then he gave her a bottle of tonic, which he said consisted of ox blood and hemoglobin. He added some crystals, which he said were also tonic, and stated that he would make his influence gentler still, although he assured us he was not forcing her in any way. But still my wife showed no improvement. Once more, on the Saturday before Christmas 1950, we went to SJ to tell him that he must, at all costs, do something. We were persuaded that it was all his doing, since he was using his magnetism. "My poor friends," he replied to our complaints, "I can't do any more than I'm doing. But with you," turning to my wife, "I really don't understand. It seems as if I were faced with a blank wall. When I try to do something, there is some force which stops me from treating you. I've treated lots of others, but I've never met such a wall. I can only make one suggestion. Come and stay in the neighborhood. There I can treat you more easily." This was the way the scoundrel was drawing us unconsciously into his net. In the net. My wife was very undecided on the way home that day, but an hour later, at her request, we went back to B at SJ, and she asked him to take her that very evening to the hotel, which was about a mile and a half from SJ. No doubt overjoyed, but showing no signs of it, the healer immediately telephoned the hotel to say that he was bringing two persons who wanted accommodation. That evening at 9 o'clock we set off. We stopped at the hotel from Saturday until the following Thursday without any improvement in my wife's condition. Christmas was approaching and my wife wanted to spend it at home. Her state of health was becoming more and more critical. She seemed lost. She didn't recognize me anymore, and she would say to me, "I don't know you," and she said vous, not the familiar tu. "I don't want to see you." What was worse, she seemed to have lost all her affection for Annie, whom she used to adore. If she had a knife in her hand when she was cooking, she would go up to the little girl as if to do her an injury. She felt she was being driven by some inner force. However, she resisted. But once the idea came into her head that she should strangle the child, she was still being driven by this strange force. Fortunately, again she was able to resist, but she began to cry. She suffered intolerably from knowing that she was harboring such terrible intentions against her daughter. In January 1951, one day when she was still in bed, she said, "Go and see B. Tell him he must come and see me. I'm fed up with the whole business. He's got to stop it." I did as she wanted. In evening, after his consultations, B came to our house. He asked to speak to my wife alone. Then he told her to come to his house alone. So I took her to his house and left her there alone with him for about half an hour. When she came out, she seemed a bit confused. So I said, "What's the matter? You're looking very queer." "Oh," she said, "it's that idiot of a B. He wanted me to be his mistress." I replied, "Don't talk nonsense. Let's hear no more of it." The healer had not pressed her, particularly since the house was full of people, though his own wife was not there. But, as we shall see, the scoundrel had not given up hope. The month of January passed. My wife was still in a bad way, and she was particularly antagonistic to little Annie. It became such a terrible obsession with her that she could not hold out, and at the beginning of February she said to me, "You know, I must go to SJ for treatment. I shall be closer to B so that he can treat me, and I shall tell him to get me out of this. I can't stand it any more, and I must get away from my daughter because I'm afraid of doing her harm." We realized afterwards, of course, that this was just the cunning of Satan, working to B's orders in making use of her fears for her daughter to throw her back on B. He hadn't swallowed my wife's refusal of his first proposition. Do you really think it will do any good to be near him? I don't trust him. But since she insisted, I took her back to the hotel where we had stopped before, and I left her there alone because I had to get back to my work. There was a great deal of coming and going until the following Thursday. My wife had been there since Friday. On Tuesday morning, B came into her room while she was still in bed and made some quite shameless propositions. My wife was indignant and told him so in suitable terms. Then she added, "Leave me alone. I shall tell my husband everything." Threats. At this renewed rebuff, B became threatening. "If you tell your husband, you'll regret it. I don't like resistance, and you'll be sorry for it." "What have you done," cried my wife, "to make me so ill?" "Look here," he replied angrily, "I haven't made you ill. Some fool must have done something to you." "Oh," said my wife, "well, that fool is you." His only answer was to sneer. "I suppose I've just cast a spell on you, that's all." My wife did not really understand and went on, "I'm going to telephone my husband this afternoon and tell him to come and fetch me. Well, I tell you, you are not to phone, and you are to stay here." Thereupon he left the room in a towering rage and went down into the restaurant cafe. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon he came back and said, "Well, have you thought over what I said to you?" And then he offered her some nougat, which he had got out of a sweet machine. My wife took the nougat and flung it in his face, saying, "You're revolting. There's your nougat. I'm going to telephone my husband." "Well," replied B, "we shall see. You'll be sorry you refused." As a matter of fact, my wife had tried in vain the whole afternoon to get to the telephone booth, which was only about 5 or 6 yards away from her room in the hotel itself. But it was only late that evening, when I rang up as usual to get the latest news, that she managed to drag herself painfully as far as the telephone and say in a low whisper, "Come quickly and fetch me." It was all she had the strength to say. But I understood what it meant. By 10 o'clock I was there, and I found her in tears. On Wednesday morning, in spite of her exhaustion, she managed somehow to put on her clothes. With some difficulty I managed to get her to the station, much to the helpless indignation of B, who happened to be taking someone to the station himself at that moment. In the train, my wife told me what had passed between B and herself, his humiliating persistence, his threats, and his audacious remark, "I can't do without you any more. I think you must have cast a spell on me." There had indeed been a spell, but it came from him, and not from my wife, who had no idea what it was all about. Effects of the sortilege. But after our return, we were soon to understand. He had said, "I don't like resistance. You will be sorry for it." Indeed, my wife began to feel the effects of his revenge immediately. She suffered more and more and had to take to her bed. This was the first fortnight of February 1951. Her ill health became a real torture. She could not get up. She could neither eat nor sleep, and was slowly wasting away. I kept her alive with orange juice, and even that she could hardly swallow. I sent for the doctor, who gave her some injections, but we could see he thought she was in a bad way. I got 4 doctors in all to see her, but with no better result. One of them suggested sending her to a psychiatric hospital, but she announced quite definitely, "I don't want to go there, doctor. I'm not mad, but I feel there is some force inside me which makes me suffer. You may think I'm going to go mad, but I'm not mad now." Towards the end of February, however, we both decided she should go to the convalescent home at Saujon, which was run by a psychiatrist, Dr. Dubois. There, she was given all the usual treatment for nervous disorders, douches, electric shocks, and so on, but nothing happened. At the end of 2 months' treatment, she had, however, gained 1 pound. The crises were less acute. This very relative improvement lasted until the month of August, but one evening, as she was going to bed, everything changed. She dropped the book she was reading, opened her eyes very wide, and cried out, my head, I'm going mad." The crisis lasted about an hour. Then she said, "It started again. That B is up to his tricks. He's trying to drive me mad." It was like shocks inside my head. Her state suddenly grew worse. She could eat nothing, and I felt quite helpless. We went to a woman healer who quietened her down for a time, but an hour after we got home it began again, only worse. It seems that there had been a series of attacks and counterattacks between the woman healer and B. Finally, we were so convinced of his responsibility that we decided to ask for a summons. We did so in September 1951. October and November passed without our hearing anything more about it, but in December we had notice to appear before the court to be confronted with B. But on that day my wife, who had been ill all night, could not get up. So I went to the court alone and explained everything to the judge. All he said was, "If your wife cannot attend, we will postpone the hearing." I didn't feel inclined to accept this. The same thing might happen every time, and our action might go against us. I met B in the corridor, and I said to him, "She shall come here in spite of you." And I managed to make her get up, and I brought her in a taxi to the court, which was about a quarter of a mile away. In the presence of the judge, my wife made her deposition. The judge asked B if he admitted the facts. He had gone white as a sheet, and seemed completely at a loss. He admitted all the facts, including the casting of a spell, and signed the statement. Even his lawyer had the wind taken out of his sails. B obviously expected a prosecution, not so much for casting spells, with which the law is not concerned, but for the illegal practice of medicine. A policeman had, in fact, called at our house shortly after I had lodged my complaint. He had found my wife in one of her crises, with a haggard expression and her arms in the air. He confiscated some medicines B had given us. "That'll be enough," he said, "to let us run him in for illegal medicine." B suspected as much, for as we left the court he came up to me and said, "You don't realize what you've brought on my head. They'll sting me for 200,000 francs in fines." And without worrying about the way he was betraying himself, he went on, "Listen, withdraw your complaint, and for my part, I've no reason to continue." So he was openly admitting what he had always believed, namely that all my wife's troubles stemmed from him. Yielding to his entreaties, we both went back into the courtroom and told the judge we were withdrawing our complaint in the interests of my wife's health. "Right," said the judge, you are withdrawing your complaint, but the court reserves the right to prosecute B for the illegal practice of medicine." When we got home, we wrote a letter to the public prosecutor saying we withdrew our complaint and notified B of our action. Fresh attacks. The healer had achieved what he wanted. My wife passed a whole month without pain, but in January 1952, it all began again, worse than ever. My wife, exasperated, wanted us to go and see B, who was visiting his mother that day. It was his mother who received us. But since my wife insisted on seeing B in person, he suddenly appeared. A violent dispute then took place in his mother's presence. Finally, since he could not get the last word, he tried to make my wife leave by taking hold of her arm. But she shook herself free and hit him on the nose. Then, as he caught hold of her again, she struck him once more, straight in the face. This time she drew blood, and his nose began to bleed violently. Then I intervened, and taking B by the arm, I told him to be quiet and leave my wife alone. He obeyed, pulled out his handkerchief, which was soon red with blood. He himself was scarlet with rage. As we were going to leave, he came after us, saying, "I've been attacked in my own home. It's unheard of. I'm going to the police." "All right," said my wife. "We'll all go together. You can lodge a complaint, and you can also explain why I struck you." Still holding his handkerchiefs to his nose, B began to threaten. "As for you," he said, "you'll end up in a madhouse." By so saying, he revealed his plans for revenge. We soon reached the police station. The inspectors were smiling to themselves to see what had happened to him. He even had the audacity to ask the superintendent to tell my wife to leave him in peace. "Well," said my wife, "why don't you make your complaint? Then I will tell them why I hit you." Thereupon he collapsed ignominiously and merely said, "No, I'm not making a complaint, but for heaven's sake, leave me alone." And as we left, he fired his passing shot. I must say, for a sick woman, you can hit hard. The healer's revenge. We were to discover later the plans the healer was cherishing in order to take revenge on a woman who had not only resisted him, but had publicly defied and humiliated him. She was to end her days in a madhouse. He had a servant ready to carry out his threats. This servant was Satan, and the sorcerer's work was made considerably easier by the fact that nowadays there are very few people who really believe in Satan. For most doctors, and for most other people too, possession is quite simply the same thing as madness. So by casting a spell over my wife and sending a devil to take possession of her, B could pretty well count on her being quickly shut up as a lunatic. That would be his revenge, lying ready for him to use. The violent dispute I have described took place on the 12th of January, 1952. We went home, not suspecting what was in store for us. The first months were, of course, months of suffering for my wife, but there was nothing to indicate that her state was getting worse. But one night in August 1952, she woke up with a start, terrified and in tears. She seized me by the arm, as if terror-struck, and with a haunted look cried out, "I'm frightened. He's here. He's coming towards the bed. Drive him away." "But what are you afraid of?" I asked, trying to calm her down. "There, he's there, a beast with claws and the body of a serpent, but with B's head." And she kept on calling out, "He's coming closer to the bed. I'm frightened." She was shouting in her terror and distress, and that lasted all night. In the morning she was exhausted. Her suffering continued. 2 or 3 nights running the attacks went on. She was seized by a sort of delirium. She seemed to collapse into herself, and suddenly, as if in a trance, she began to speak in foreign languages, laughing distractedly, and moving about restlessly for 3/4 of an hour or more. Then, when the crisis had passed, she would come to herself and say, "What happened to me? I thought I didn't exist anymore. I couldn't see anything. Oh, how my neck aches." And I, her husband, still not knowing it was Satan, I was miserable at my own helplessness. B's threats kept echoing in my ears. "You will end up in a madhouse." I kept turning the words over and over in my mind, wondering what would happen to us. There was naturally no lack of advice from friends and neighbors, but, of course, none of them thought of the presence of a devil. Various people persuaded us to go and see different healers, but none of them could help us, and they gave up the case when they learnt they were dealing with B. The doorway to salvation. Whilst all this was going on, another daughter was born to us in December 1952. In spite of her mother's terrible ordeal during the year, the child did well. One thing I should mention is that after those terrifying nights, my wife could no longer endure the sight of a crucifix or religious pictures or a rosary, particularly not a rosary, in the house. During her crises, she would talk of nothing but of throwing them all out. But this sudden aversion to blessed objects did not open our eyes to the satanic element in these new developments. One day in February 1953, Providence, for it was surely an intervention of Providence, without any merit on our part, brought us to Father Berger. We told him our story, just as we had done to so many others. He received us with great kindness, but told us we would first have to get a medical opinion to see if there was any natural cause or not. He said he could not take action until this had been established, but that he would be very ready to help us if it should prove necessary. A fortnight passed after this visit. At the end of February, we decided at a friend's suggestion to consult the priest of Belef. Strangely enough, we had trouble with the journey, both coming and going. The taxi had one breakdown after another, something that had never happened on to the chauffeur before. At Belef, and they're spelling Belef with 3 dots after, so I guess they're truncating the name of the place to preserve anonymity. At Belef, we told our story again. After half an hour, the almoner handed us a little book, advising us to read it and follow its instructions. He, for his part, would do what was necessary, but he pointed out that it might take 6 months or more. It would all depend on the will of God, who had his reasons for sending us these trials. Religious conversion. All that we had suffered since 1950 had, unknown to us, been preparing us to accept what we were now asked to do. We listened to the priest's advice. We went home determined to follow it to the best of our ability. On the way home, we again had one breakdown after another, and the chauffeur declared that this was the only time in his life that he had had so many. But for the first time, for many, many days, my wife felt calmer. The priest who received us had, we discovered later, performed the most effective exorcism at a distance. It was Satan himself who told us about it later. And yet, in these February days of 1953, we were still not thinking about his presence. But an astonishing transformation soon took place in us. Up to then, we had hardly considered ourselves believers, and certainly not practicing Christians. All at once, under the influence of a grace which we only learnt to appreciate later, we formed the decision to go to Mass every Sunday, to partake of the sacraments, and to communicate frequently. The advice we had been given was beginning to bear fruit. The divine action was one of prodigious strength. Our conversion took place very rapidly. We began to understand things we had not hitherto known about, and yet, when my wife wanted to attend Mass, there was enormous difficulty. One has to have lived through something like that to have any idea of what it was like, but we stuck to it. Prayers were said for us. It was like a battle which had started between two conflicting armies, without our being aware of it. In the next chapter, we shall deal with the most striking episode in this battle, which was to last for many years.